So far, we've covered a number of the key features of Microsoft Defender for Cloud and how to configure the compliance settings in there. For a bunch of the next modules, we want to start taking a look at the actual resources that are going to be monitored using Defender for Cloud. And so we're going to spend this whole module basically looking at specifically security features that then could have Defender for Cloud assessments run against them. Those are those controls that we mentioned in that first module. Network security is a critical aspect of maintaining a secure and reliable infrastructure. Azure provides a powerful tool called an NSG or Network Security Group that allows organizations to filter network traffic and enforce access controls in their cloud environments. In this module, we'll explore how to utilize Azure NSGs to enhance network security and protection of your resources. By the end of this training module, you should be able to understand the purpose and the benefits of using an NSG to filter traffic, and you'll learn how to create and configure NSGs to enforce access control for Azure resources. You're going to gain insights into how NSGs can be used to allow or deny specific traffic traffic based on the source, destination, and the port, as well as understand how to prioritize NSG rules and leverage Azure NSG flow logs for monitoring and troubleshooting, and finally recognize the role of an NSG in implementing network security best practices in Azure. And all of that is going to be covered if you want to deploy it first and then use Windows Defender for Cloud to actually monitor that security that you've put in place to make sure that it's meeting your governance and compliance requirements. So when you take a look at an Azure resource group, now I'm going to come back to these slides in a few minutes. So what I want to do is actually go off to a whiteboard session, and I'm going to go into the portal and show you some of these things. And then I'm kind of come back and follow up. As I said, if you were following along with the learning path material, each of these slides is going to be covered in a specific learning path. And if I do that right now, you take a look at the learning path, you'll see that each of these areas of what is an Azure resource group, what is a virtual network, how to network security groups are filtering the network traffic, application security groups, these become all of those specific topics. I'm going to cover them collectively in a conversation, and then I'll come back and review some of the key highlights in the slides, and if you're following along in the content, point that out. So let's go to the portal and the whiteboard to take a look at network security. Now, some of the concepts I'm about to introduce are probably fairly well known by you. Hopefully, if not, this is going to be just a refresher, or if it's new to you, we've got whole learning paths that you can take to get deeper information in these concepts. But I just want to make sure I cover them at a high level. And I'm going to focus on it from a Defender for Cloud perspective, and I'll hopefully bring that flavor into it of why you want to do this and what features in Windows Defender do you have to check for compliance to make sure that these configurations are in place. Now, network communications, whether they be on premises, in the cloud, or in a hybrid world, talking to each other, we want to take a look at what is the security configuration and why is it important that we set some of these compliance features up to make sure that maybe certain types of traffic are encrypted and certain types of information cannot be accessed from the public internet. So we'll take a look at all those concepts from a networking perspective. I'll talk generally, then we'll go into the portal and configure these. Now, what you're seeing on the screen is just a sample that I have. I've built it as a building, and I've taken an IP address that I've given of a 10.1.0.0/16. This is the CIDR notation that represents the TCP/IP IV4 numbering system that is available in TCP/IP that most organizations are going to run as their protocol. Now, what you can then do, and in Azure, I'll use the Azure specific terms, I want to create a thing called a VNet and then a subnet that you're working within it. And so you'll take an address range. In this case, I'm going to take what is called a Class A or a 10 private IP address range that is going to give me quite a number of flexible options for networks that I can have, as well as local host addresses within that range. And so in Azure, I'm going to call this a VNet. And I'm going to show you in the lab in just a second. I'm going to do an exercise where I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a VNet that is very similar to this one here. I think it's a 10.0.0.0 address, and you're going to see the /16 and 24 that I'm going to be talking about. Now this is great. So in this case, in my building, I've got this address range that represents all of the potential resources in this building. Now it gives me roughly about 64,000 IP addresses. And by default, every device on this network, even though they're across multiple floors, you'll see that they've got a routing device that ties them all together. And by default, all of the IP addresses in a VNet are going to be able to communicate with each other. Now, from a security perspective, probably not a good idea. Now, whether this is going to be in a building like this, or maybe it's in your applications that are deployed in the cloud. And what we often talk about in application development is, I'll use the term front end. Maybe this is a portion of the application that is exposed to the end users. Doesn't have to be to the public internet, but this is where users are going to interact with the front end of your application. And then what I want to have is what's called a middle tier, or sometimes called a business tier. So I want a middle tier that my front end talks to the middle tier. And then in the back end, I have maybe my database. This is where my system of record is, the valuable information of the resources. And rarely do you ever want the front end to talk directly to the back end, because remember, the front end is exposed to a public access or maybe a large group of users. And if they had direct access to the data tier itself, they could potentially compromise, either intentionally or accidentally, and gain access to that system of record of the valuable information. So you want to start to segment that information from a compliance perspective to make sure that your front ends don't talk directly to the back end. And so how we're going to do this is by creating that VNet and then creating subnets within the VNet itself. And then we're going to start to overlay security components on top of that to actually control that traffic. And this is where that term that I mentioned of an NSG, or the network security group, and application security groups that we have to then control traffic in and out of the resources in here. And all of them then could be managed. If you go back to the standard of compliance that we deployed in that first lesson, we actually had a whole section that covered network communications, and then you could monitor to say, is this configured the way that my compliance or my organization needs me to have it built? So in this model, let me just raise some of this up here for us. So I've got my VNet consisting of the IP address 10.1.0.0. I'm going to then create 3 subnets. I'm going to call this subnet 1. That is going to have the 10.1.1.0/24 address. Now this is that CEDR notation or CIDR notation that indicates where my network address. So this would be referred to as the 10.1.1 network. I have subnet number 2 and subnet 3. Each one has an address range defined within it. So 10.1.1.0, 10.1.2.0, and 10.1.3.0. Now, that's great. So by default in Azure, a VNet can be made up of one or more subnets as long as it falls within inside of the range of the VNet itself, and there's no overlapping use of the IP addresses between the subnets. We've got system-defined routes that are there by default that will automatically route traffic between all those subnets. So that's great. It's great that I've subnetted those, but it hasn't fixed my security issue. Those subnet 1 users can see all the traffic and all the resources on subnet number 3. So I've got to find some way that I can control this. Now, one of the things I can do is I can have a UDR, a user-defined route, that specifically routes traffic in a specific way. But it's not going to be very compliant. It doesn't enforce some of the features that I might want to stop that traffic from coming through. And so this is where the term an NSG comes in. So an NSG, or network security group, is a set of rules that you can define for inbound and outbound traffic based on TCP ports, based on protocols, based on source and destination locations. And you'll see all this in the example. Now, you can define the NSG and then apply it to one or more areas. Now, the areas that you can apply an NSG to is to a subnet. You can also deploy it to the network card inside of a subnet. So I can actually have an NSG that protects a specific resource. Now, the nice thing about an NSG at the subnet level, it's going to protect the entire resources of that subnet. And you might have, in my case, I've got 256 resources in each of my subnets. So there's a lot of resources in there, and I can protect them all with an NSG at the subnet level. Now, if I wanted to protect one server talking to another server in the same subnet, I could do that at the network card level. But let's say of my 256 VMs that I've got, or virtual machines running in that subnet, I want half talking to each other and the other half not talking. Well, that means I have to apply two different NSGs to 125 or 126 network cards. Well, that doesn't seem very economical or easy for me to manage. And so this is where we're going to get into things called application security groups, or ASGs. An ASG, or application security group, is a collection of resources that can be in the same subnet or across multiple subnets in the same VNet that you're working with, that it can now have the application security group, or even across other VNets, that it would then have a rule. So now you can have all of the applications. So in this case, I might have a very large application. Maybe I want to separate my production tier from my test tiers and want to separate them, and I could have an application security group for my application running in the test environment versus on the production environment. Just not that you would typically do that, but just showing you some of the ways and flexibilities you have. So the key concepts here: you have to understand what an IP address is. You have to understand what a VNet is. You have to understand what a subnet is. You want to understand that subnets by default can talk to each other in a VNet. Now, you could create two separate VNets, and I've got an example of that here. If I go over in this environment. So what I've got an example is of two different address ranges. I'm going to call this my VNet 1, and this is my VNet 2. Now, by default, VNet 1, and we're going to call this sub 1, sub 2, and sub 3. By default, this VNet and these three subnets, they can all talk to each other. This VNet and its three subnets, they can all talk to each other by default. That's great, but these two VNets cannot talk to each other by default. I can do a thing called VNet peering that allows these two VNets to talk to each other. And then again, by default, all of the subnets in VNet 1 can now talk to all of the VNets, or the subnets in VNet 2. Don't want that, so this is where I'm going to want to start to have this compliance feature where I want to be able to segment my traffic, control the permissions, and then monitor it with Defender for Cloud to make sure that it is in a compliant state and somebody hasn't changed something or maybe misconfigured those values, and I could then get that in my Microsoft Defender for Cloud features that indicates and flags that as a non-compliant deployment. And so we'll go in and be doing this in the portal in just a few minutes, where we're going to walk you through the configuration of VNets, subnets, NSGs, as well as application security groups. So let's go to the portal. So before I actually go into the exercise, you'll see that I've followed along in the learning path. I've got the specific modules that we're taking a look at of virtual networks, network security groups. And here's that exercise. I showed this in a previous module, that you're going to be able to launch this exercise, and it gives you an idea of what we're going to be trying to do. We're going to create an NSG, a network security group, that is going to be applied at the VNet level. So here's my VNet 1, and I can then have different subnets. So I've got subnet 1, and then I've got virtual machines inside of the subnet. And so there would also be, it's not listed here, I could have a network card. Now the NSG can be applied at the subnet level. So I think I might have identified it as appearing at the VNet level. The NSGs apply at the subnet levels and at the network card levels of the resources inside of the subnet itself. And so what we're then going to do is to create the rule that will either allow or deny communications in or outbound through the port. So that's what you're going to see. And here are the steps that I'm going to be walking through in the portal to show that creation to you. So I'm going to go to the portal. So the first thing they want me to do is to create a virtual network. Now, how you do this in the order, it doesn't really matter. You could build the resource group. You could then go into the resource group and you could build virtual machines. You could build VNets and NSGs. The order doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you're just going to be putting these pieces together. So I'm going to start off with, as based on the lab, if you're following along, is I want to come to my virtual networks. I'm going to ask for a virtual network. And you can see I've got a series of them already out here. Now, the one that they want me to create, just from a timing perspective, I'm going to be like a baking show or cooking show. I'm going to prepare everything, I'm going to put it in the oven, and then just pull it right back out, and it's already completed. But I want to walk through the steps. So I'm going to create a virtual network. And you'll see I've got a series of tabs here of values that I can create. I can select the subscription that I want it to use, and sub 1 or sub 2. Now, going back to what I mentioned at the beginning, remember, you deploy Microsoft Defender for Cloud at different scopes. And if you deploy it to a scope of a subscription and you don't apply it to both, in my case, 2 subscriptions, you could potentially have that protection of Microsoft Defender for Cloud on a subscription and another subscription deploying the resources that are no longer protected. So you want to make sure that you understand that hierarchy that I started this conversation with. So I'm going to use sub number 1. And then you got to give it a virtual network name. Now, what they want me to do is to call it VNet 1. I've already created one, so I'm going to create one called VNet 1A, just so you can see it. You can see it barked at me saying I can't do that because there's already one in there. So in this subscription, in this resource group, I've already got one by that name. Now, I could also create a different resource group. I can click that and then create a resource group. So you don't have to create the resource group first. You can create it at the time that you're going to create resources to go into the resource group. You then have to select a region to deploy it to. Now, they want you to go to US East. The region you deploy to really doesn't matter from the exercise perspective. My subscription doesn't allow me to deploy it to US East, so I've selected US West. Now, from a compliance perspective, it does make a difference because resources, like network resources and storage, have to be deployed to a region. And then depending on that region, your compliance might vary. Again, I use the example of if you're deploying in the European region and you're storing data and it's going to be accessed through a network communication, you've got to deploy a resource for storage in Europe and the network resources in Europe. And then you might want to apply a compliance requirement for GDPR. And in North America, you might have the same application, but that data might be now compliant to the HIPAA regulations for the Health Information Protection Act. So these are an important design perspective from a Defender for Cloud capability, because where you deploy your resources may impact the scope and the compliance values that you're going to send to those resources. Now, from an IP address range, this is where we talked about it. Now, I'm going to start with that 10.0.0.0/16. That's very similar to the example that I gave you on my whiteboarding. And you can see that I have a subnet that I can work with, and it's going to build a default subnet that is going to go to that /24, and it's going to take all 256 IP addresses. Now, I could add additional subnets here, or I can edit the one that's in here, and that's what they want you to do in the exercise if you're following along. They want you to change the name of this subnet. They want to call it subnet 1. I'll do that. You can then change the address. They don't want you to change that. They'll leave it all the same. Save it. And it's now called subnet 1. Again, if you want to add more, you can. And then you can review and create this object. It happens fairly quickly. I'm not going to do that just to stay in standard with the lab. So I've got VNet 1 here, which is what they wanted me to create. And you can see it's got those same attributes of the subnet, of subnet 1, defined with that IP address. The next thing that they want you to do is to create a thing called an application security group. The application security group is like a network security group, but it's going to deploy a select group of resources, in our case virtual machines, that might exist in the same subnet in a VNet. It might exist in multiple subnets in the VNet. It could exist in different subnets in different VNets. But it's a way of grouping a set of resources together based on the application that it might be running. Going back to my example, I might have a web application front end that is running in Europe, it's running in North America, and I want the same NSG rules applied to the application in both those regions. I could do that with an NSG, but then those resources talk to a middle tier. I want the same rule applied. Do I do that as an application security group if it's going to have other resources in the same subnets that you want to separate? So that's where the application security group is going to give me more flexibility. So similar to what I did for the resource group, I can come in and say application security security groups. Again, I've created two already that they wanted you to create an application security group for management and one for that web front end. And so similar to the tiers that I talked about, they don't get into the back end in this example. But you're going to say create. You're going to select the resource group after the subscription. You're going to go into the same resource group. And then what they want you to do is create the name called Application Security Group West or Web. So it is basically just a container object that doesn't have anything in it. We're going to put resources in after the fact. But creating the application security group is pretty straightforward. But they're going to have you create the two application security groups for the web and for the management tier. And you can see that I've already created those just from a expediency perspective for the demonstration. The next thing I want to create then is a network security group. Again, doing a search for network security groups. Just going back there for a second. As Azure has evolved, you'll notice that I've got network two different versions to work with. I've got a classic version and the current version. Wherever possible, you can still deploy classics if there's reasons, and maybe you got consistency for the last couple of years, but wherever possible, you typically want to use the most current version. And in the lab steps, they specifically ask you to select the application or the network security group non-classic version. So in here, they want you to create the NSG. Again, you want to create it in a resource group of the same one we're working with. It needs a name. I'm going to call it NSG1, and you can expect that it's going to not like that name because I've already got one in there. I'll call it 1A. And again, there's not much for me to configure because right now this is just a container object in which I'm going to apply a series of custom roles to, and then I'm going to assign that NSG to either a subnet or to a network card. So I'm going to say review and create. It will go through and build that, and you can see that I've already done that. I've created NSG1. Now taking a look at the NSG itself, you can take a look at, I've got the subnets. And so this is where I'm going to take that NSG, and I would have assigned it, so associated is the term they use. So you say associate it with, and you find the virtual network, that VNet, and then which subnet in that VNet. You can see that I've got that one subnet. If I had multiple subnets, I could define it to some or all the subnets in that VNet that you're working with. So I've assigned it already, or associated it with a subnet inside of a VNet. And then what I can start doing is taking a look at the inbound and outbound rules. So remember, traffic flows in and out of these secure environments, whether it be at the subnet level or at the network card level. Now, by default, rules are processed on a first in, first out basis until it finds a rule that matches the requirements of that rule. Now, it starts with the lowest number. In this case, 100 is the value. It's going to check that one first, and it's going to go through this list until it finds a rule that meets that it can meet based on the traffic pattern, and then it stops processing further rules. So you got to be very careful how you deploy these rules and make sure that they're in the correct order of processing. Again, for Microsoft Defender for Cloud, this is going to be something that you may want to check for compliance to make sure that that order is going to appear in the right order, to make sure that the rule is going to, not block traffic or not allow too much traffic, either one, unnecessarily. So absolutely applicable. It's one of the values. Remember, we talked about the standard. And in this case, it's going to be the baseline standard that's built by default. And then we got into the content areas. And in there's going to be a network security area, of which we then get a subcontrol that is going to get into the firewall rules that you want, or the NSG rules. Now, I can add, and this is what I did, is I added a rule. And you give the rule potentially a name. What is the source port? What is the destination? Now, in this case, they had you change it to an application security group. What protocols do you want it to work with? TCP, UDP, any protocols? Do you want to allow it or deny it? And then there's that priority feature that they want you to associate it with. Now, you'll see that I've got one for allow all traffic on port 80 and port 443. I'll just take a look at this. And so you can see I configured, that's the first one that they have you do in the exercise. Now then they have you build a second rule, and I left it for me to do in this exercise. I want to build a rule. I'm going to add a new one. And this time it's going to be going to an application security group. Which application security group do I want to go to? And this one I want to assign it to the management application security group. The service is RDP. I want to do for, this is the remote desktop protocol. So this is going to take management connectivity to that device. And you'll see that it actually automatically goes to port 3389. That's the default port for RDP access. I'm going to allow that traffic. You can see it goes to the next highest priority. And I'm going to say that this name is going to be called allow any. And so now what you see is I've got two rules that will be processed. On an inbound process, if it's on port 80 or 443, it will allow it. And on this case, it's going to allow port 3389 inbound. Any other ports, by default, are going to be blocked. And you can see these are the default rules, and that's an eye-winking moment from an exam perspective. Each of the inbound and outbound rule has a default set of rules, 3 of them, at the highest level. You can see these are up in the 65,000 range. So they're going to be processed last to potentially block certain types of traffic. So it goes through this list to find something that it meets that. If it's port 80, and it is not TCP, it will be blocked because it doesn't meet the requirement. It goes to the next rule. It's port 80, it's TCP, doesn't meet the rule, and it comes down and says, sure enough, it says allow inbound VNet traffic from any port, port 80, to any port, port 80, virtual network. Is it going to allow it or deny it? And it goes through and then starts to block those with those default rules. Now, the same thing can happen on the outbound. Now, this isn't talked about in the course, but it's funny how many people think about protecting their network segments from traffic coming into them. But you also want to make sure that you don't exfiltrate or export data. And so I often will configure outbound rules because I want to make sure that in the case of my front end, middle tier, back end tier, I want to make sure that my front end talks to the middle tier, and the middle tier can talk back to the front end tier. And I want to make sure that the middle tier can also talk to the back end, and the back end can talk to the middle tier, but not the front end. So those inbound and outbound rules are something that you want to make sure that you can configure in your Defender for Cloud compliance requirements, that you're just not going to, block traffic inbound and I'm not worried about outbound traffic. So it's be my pro tip for you to be able to take a look at and implement. Now, the last thing that they want you to do then is to build some virtual machines. Now, this is building infrastructure. It's not necessarily a Microsoft Defender for Cloud feature. These are the resources that are going to be protected. And so getting into a virtual machine, you can see I've got 2 virtual machines. They want you to create VM1 and VM2. I've already created them, but I'll just walk through the steps here. Creating an Azure virtual machine. Again, it has to have a subscription. Which resource group do you want to put it into? What is the virtual machine name? I'll call it VM3. Which region do you want it to be deployed? We're not going to get into all the settings. They just want to bring it down to the simplest feature to get into. They want a username and password. So I'm going to need a username. I'll paste in a username, and I've got a password here that I'll paste in for simplicity's sake. This will be used to connect to the device remotely. You can also potentially use an Microsoft Entra ID to connect to them. I don't want to have public inbound ports. But you can now see I've got disk management and networking. So I can now connect this to a virtual network, which is what they have you do, connecting it to VNet1. And then which subnet do you want to connect it to within that VNet? So remember, we might have multiple. So you can actually place this resource inside of a subnet within inside of a VNet. And we've got an NSG that's going to apply to that subnet. And then they just have you go through and create these 2 resources. Now, it takes a few minutes to do this. This is why I did it beforehand. Also because I wanted to start collecting data for future lab demonstrations. But that's going to basically get us through to the creation of the resources that we wanted to be able to work with. Now, the last one that we want to do is associate the application security group. I'm going to just cancel that.
I want to come to VM number 1.
So on the virtual machine, you can see that I've got network settings that I'm working on. It has all the information of the network interface that it's got. What is the virtual network and subnets in VNet1? On subnet number 1, there's the public IP address, and there's the private IP address in that 10.0.0 network. You got the 4th IP address in there. I'm not going to get into it, but the first 3 are reserved for Microsoft use within every subnet that you're dealing with. So I want to come into Application Security Group, and I can add an Application Security Group. Now, I've already done that, but you just simply click that Application Security Group, and you can see I've got the management one already selected, but I can now apply from the list of application security groups that I've got configured. I can apply to this virtual machine this application security group. So we've taken a look at how to create those objects in the portal. I want to go back and do a review of the actual content because I skipped over it. I just want to highlight a couple of things if you're following along with the learning path before we close out this module. Now, remember we talked about this concept of deploying your Microsoft Defender for Cloud to different scopes. And we've talked about the tenant, we've talked about the management groups and the subscription. The resource groups are a grouping of objects that inherit stuff from their parent object. In this case, the parent object is the subscription. And so if you deploy by default something to the subscription, all the resource groups that were deployed using that subscription from a billing construct would then be monitored as well. So understand that hierarchy. Now, there's several ways that you can build a resource group. Kind of the traditional way back in the on-premises world where people group together objects of a similar type, all the routers, all the firewalls, all the SQL servers. To kind of more of a modern approach, and the one that Microsoft recommends, is that resource groups should contain the objects that share a common life cycle. They get created together, they get consumed together, and then they're going to be updated and deleted or end of life together. So that, it could include everything in my example from previously, everything from the front end web applications and the load balancers that you need to the middle tier application servers to the back end data servers. They might share a common resource group. And then there would then also potentially share a common Windows Defender for Cloud compliance features that you're working with. That's just one way that you take a look at it. We're going to be talking about regionally based deployments as well. You can do it based around those regions. But a resource group, as it says here, is just a container object. It is just a way to control objects. And as a general rule, you'll hear people from Microsoft refer to it as resources that share a common life cycle. We then take a look at other types of resources that you're monitoring. And networking is a huge part, whether it be in the cloud, on premises, or that hybrid world of talking from the on-premises world to cloud or vice versa. You want to make sure that you've set up a lot of security features. We've talked about, the VNets and the subnets. We've talked about the system-defined routes, the user-defined routes. We've talked about adding in the different types of, for all intents and purposes, firewalls. They're called NSGs, or network security groups. It is a software-based, basically, firewall that doesn't do some of the advanced features of a firewall, like deep packet inspection and SSL offloading. It really is kind of like a bouncer that just does rough port analysis from destination, source, port numbers, all that kind of stuff that I showed you briefly when we configured the network security group. And a version of the network security group, because an NSG can be applied at the subnet level or at the NIC level of a device in the subnet, but we have this other construct that came in to be more loosely defined as an application security group. So this is a series of resources that are maybe part of a same application, whether it be front end, middle tier, back end, across multiple regions. They can now exist within the same software defined environment of an application security group. So virtual networks, important part, and as a feature of the default security standard defined in Windows Defender for Cloud, is going to be one of the things that you can monitor to make sure that it is compliant to your security requirements. We talked about the filtering at whether it be an NSG or whether it be an application security group. We have both inbound and outbound rules. There's some default rules in both to monitor. And remember, we talked about that hierarchical order processing. The higher the number, the lower the priority, and later on in the process. As you create new objects, new rules to either allow or disallow communication, it starts at the lowest number. 100 is typically where people go. And make sure you leave enough room. You saw that in the example. I went 100 and 110. You don't want to go 100, 101, 102, because it gives no room to add something in between there. And it stops at the first one that it applies to. So for example, if you had a deny all at 100 and allow port 80 at 110, everything comes in, and because that deny everything is 100, no traffic would get through. And when in fact what you might have wanted to do is to put the allow port 80 and then stop all traffic. So those are some of the features. Another thing, when you take a look at a term I used early on called defense in depth, you want to make sure that you're secure by default. And it's not that you have to block traffic, because by default traffic is going to be blocked. So you have to open these services up. So don't open up a whole bunch of stuff and then have to try and lock something down. You're better off just to only open it up for those specific conditions you're looking for. A line I like to use is a deny or a disallow typically should be used to prove the rule and not be the rule. Because the rule by default, if you don't have any access, is it's disallowed. That's the default capability. So you don't have to put in the specific ones, but you'll see that the default rules have those down at the very end, basically granting you that disallow capability. Seeing how that they get filtered, we take a look here. We talked about where the NSGs could be applied. You can apply them at the subnet level. You can have multiple NSGs that are going to be applied there. And so how do they get applied? And if you have one at the NSG level, or if you have an NSG at the subnet level and one at the actual NIC level, and then an application, you've got 3 firewalls that you're going to be working through to get in and out. So in fact, there's potentially 6 rules that you're going to want to make sure are going to allow for the necessary traffic. So make sure that they're configured properly, because at the subnet, the application security group, and then at the NIC level, they're going to have to get processed in that order, both on the inbound and the outbound, and a great use of Microsoft Defender for Cloud to make sure that those configurations are proper and haven't changed, potentially causing either a security breach or no communication at all, because it's actually being too restrictive in what it's doing. And here's the application security group, and it's a little bit of a busy slide, but what you're seeing there is that ability to not do it at the entire subnet. You know, as I said, you might have a subnet that has hundreds or thousands of devices that could be in that subnet. And I need to segment the traffic, because if they're on the same subnet, remember, by default, there's nothing that stops it. I could actually stop the default configuration from one subnet to another, but within the subnet, it's basically as if it was on the same wire. So this is a way for us to now partition traffic by a grouping of devices that are in that same subnet. This is a great way to think of it. And that's what they're trying to show you there. I then went through and showed that exercise. So hopefully this is giving you an idea of, you know, the security requirement that networking provides for you when it's configured, and then expanding that out to now using Defender for Cloud as a method to monitor those implementations of network security to make sure that they are meeting your security compliance. Hope you enjoyed the deployment of resources and potentially configuring them under a compliance requirement. I look forward to seeing you in the next module.